Hello class. I'd like to show you how to approach that Fahrenheit problem today. Right before we went over the Fahrenheit problem, we talked about input and how to get input from Python using an input function. And then when we actually went to implement the solution, a lot of people didn't seem to want to use that input function or sort of forgotten what that input function was going to do. So first of all, if I use the input function right away, it's kind of letting me know, hey, you can put a prompt here, and then it's kind of commenting that you could have these quotation marks preceding arguments, blah, blah, blah. It's a little bit hard to maybe understand what that means. It says read a string from standard input. Bottom line is what the parameter the input function is going to take is a string, and that string message will be displayed to the user. So you wanted that string message just to be like C. It's just like sitting there, C prompt, and that's really it. That's what you want that input function to do. So I'm just going to go ahead and run this thing real quick, and let's call this Fahrenheit WalkThru. All right, and so let's run this thing now. One thing I would do, and I saw some people sort of go back and forth between the shell and the file, especially the shell is not going to have a huge kind of output situation here, and really you're not going to need to extend much on the file. So I'd like to have both these windows open. If I could see both these windows at the same time, that'd be really cool. So the input we had in the example was 100, right? So I type in 100. And the cool thing about that is it worked. It didn't give me an error, so that's a nice thing. The sort of problem with this, or where I need to go from here, is I typed in the value 100, but how do I access that value? I want to work with that value. I want to do some math to that value to change it and to make it a Fahrenheit value. So you could just do the math of the input, but I would say that's kind of ugly code in some ways. Like we're not creating variable names, we're not making the code super readable, which is probably one of our main goals at this point. So this theme is going to come up again and again and again in the course, which is how do I access this value? How do I hold on to the value? How do I how do I put myself in a position to be able to recall the value, change the value, make decisions based on the value? So that's a variable. The more you start to think to yourself, well, geez, how do I keep that value? That's a variable. So what do we call this variable? Well, we could call it C. We could call it Celsius because it really is the Celsius value. So again, what I would do here is I would run this thing after one. I just typed in one thing before and I ran it. Now it looks like, oh, it's the same thing. Well, the difference though is if I reference that variable Celsius, it has a value. It's holding on to that value. Now, it could be a good thing that I ran this file, because when I look at Celsius, it's got those quotation marks on it. So it's indicating to me that's a string. And I want to be aware of that, because I could go ahead and try to do some math to this thing, but I'd be doing math to a string, and I don't want to do that. So, and if I'm not sure about that, I'm kind of like, well, wait a sec. Yeah, it can't be right. It can't be a string. Well, I could check the type of Celsius, and sure enough, it is a string. It is a string. So we talked about a couple ways you could change that. One way is to simply typecast the variable, and then you see now it looks like an integer. The issue with that, though, is it just creates the integer value in that instance where it's being typecast. So it doesn't permanently change the value of Celsius. So if I check Celsius now, even though it was typecast as an int, it's still a string, right? It returns a value of an integer just for that moment, but doesn't permanently change the value. So we did talk about that in class, how we could permanently change something. So one way to do that would be to do something like this, right? Something like that. That would change it. So it's kind of an interesting construction, because what's going to happen is Python's going to evaluate the right side. It's always going to evaluate the right side of that equal sign first. And so it's going to be taking the old value of Celsius, putting in that typecasting function, returning the value of 100, just like you see right here, the integer value of 100. And then once it's done that, it's going to then store it in a variable called Celsius over there on the left. Well, we already have a variable called Celsius. What happens when we use the same variable name is we're essentially overwriting the old variable. Like that old Celsius variable is gone, and it's essentially being replaced with this new variable of the same name, which has this different value. So what it looks like, though, is happening is that Celsius has now changed to permanently be an integer. And so another way you could sort of accomplish the same idea is you could typecast the line right there, and now your input is an integer. So either way, you could have taken the typecasting out here, or you could have a separate line, whatever you want. Let's show some lines. Okay. So either way, like they accomplish the same thing, is what I'm saying. And so now, again, if we run this, I would run it. I would run this thing, and I would type this in, and I would say, okay, hey, what's Celsius? Is it an integer now? Yes, it is. And so, notice, I kind of think a lot of people will sit there for a while, maybe they might get a line, but it's very rare that the introductory person wants to run their program for one line. And I would say the funny thing is the more you write program, the more you're going to want to test your program after one line or 2 lines or every line that you add. Just because you know how much more painful it is to go back and try to figure out, a large block of code where you're not exactly sure when the last time it was really functioning properly was. So this way, hopefully you understand how this thing is building, and you're, what I'm saying, like you're with it the whole way, and as soon as it deviates, you can isolate the problem a lot better. Okay, long story short, and there's going to be no better learning experience than making the mistake, doing the opposite, writing a longer program and then not knowing what went wrong and having to go back, and then you won't want to continue through that process. So anyways, I did give you some math. I think the math was on the board, and it said something like F equals, and then it was something like this, like 9 divided by 5 times C plus 32, something like that. That was our formula. So let's take a look at this. Well, first of all, F really stands for Fahrenheit, but I could leave it as F. By the way, variable names should be lowercase letters. Now, when I look at this formula is all good, and this I think could be tricky and confusing to people because they could see the letter C up on line 1, right? But that's not a variable. That's just a message that's being actually displayed to the user. That this particular C up here, right? The variable name is Celsius, and that's the switch you'd have to make here when you look at this formula. Is the computer doesn't know what that C is because that's referencing a variable named C, and we don't have any variable named C. So that would be a problem. Maybe we run this thing and see what happens. Okay. Yeah, it says name C is not defined. Oh yeah, we don't know what that is. The computer doesn't know what that is. Okay, but the computer does know what that is. Does know what that is. So when you run that and you type in 100, you're like, oh well, I don't see any output, but then we do see that. In fact, not only is the output, that's the output we're looking for. So really, that's kind of the big deal. But when we run this thing, we don't want to have to type in the variable Fahrenheit. We want the value to show up. So what do we need to do? We need a print statement over here, right, to get that variable or value to show up. And so we wanted this thing to say F, and then basically give us the value. So again, we're mixing a variable and and a string, right? So the way to get those two things to display cohesively together is use a comma, or you can do some typecasting. But let's just use a comma and run this thing again. Boom. So 100, and we get 212 as the output. Now you can certainly try some different. Now it's not always good to just look. So a lot of times you do a problem set as like one example. We could try 40 or something like that. We get 104. We try a bunch of other things, make sure we're getting reasonable values. But yeah, just because it satisfies one test doesn't mean it's necessarily correct. So you do usually want to try multiple tests to make sure it works. But I feel pretty good about that. So I just want to kind of talk to you guys about this and just kind of reiterate some ideas here. Number one, variable names, lowercase letters. Number two, as you build these programs, really try to just do one line at a time and then assess, like really assess after each line, is this where I want to be? What do I need to have in order to go forward? Like when we're looking at that first line, we got C to show up, we had input, we typed it in, but we didn't have a variable, we didn't have a way to access the value. So we needed that to go forward and do some math. And I would argue too, especially in the beginning, I would say a lot of this course, even the entire year, it's going to be about creating variables and manipulating the values of those variables, and again having your program make decisions about what to do based on the value of those variables. So creating variables, keeping track of their values, their types is fundamental, foundational, like exactly what you want to be thinking about right now. And so if you're writing programs, think to yourself, I'm going to make some variables. I'm going to make some variables, and I'm going to use those variables. I'm going to use it. All right, enjoy.